In the summer of 1798, a man stood on the threshold of what he believed would be his greatest adventure. He had already redrawn the map of Italy, humbled Austria, and made the streets of Paris tremble with anticipation. But Napoleon Bonaparte wanted more. He wanted the East, its ancient trade routes, its mythic grandeur, the kind of immortality that only conquest in the cradle of civilization could provide. And so he built a fleet, gathered an army and pointed them toward the horizon. What he could not see in these heady weeks of planning and ambition was that the sea itself would betray him. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. On the 19th of May, 1798, an extraordinary armada slipped out of the harbour at Toulon. It was not merely a military expedition. It was closer to a civilization moving across the water. 13 ships of the line formed the iron spine of the force, escorted by a mixture of French frigates, Venetian warships, and over 120 transport vessels. Aboard those transports were somewhere between 30,000 and 36,000 soldiers, depending on how you count the engineers, artillerymen, and the remarkable corps of scientists and scholars, the savants, who had been invited along to document and study whatever ancient wonders the army uncovered. When the full convoy assembled, some estimates placed the total number of ships at over 400. It was the kind of fleet that darkened the horizon. They moved through the Strait of Bonifacio, tracing the coastlines of Sardinia and Corsica, before converging on Malta on the 9th of June, where a further 56 vessels from a Civitavecchia convoy swelled the force to something that seemed almost impossible to oppose. By the 18th of June, they had departed again, this time aimed at Alexandria, carrying the full weight of French imperial ambition toward the sands of Egypt, and then, from the British perspective, they simply vanished. The Royal Navy knew a large French fleet had left Toulon. What they did not know, what they desperately needed to know, was where it was going. The problem was frigates, or rather the lack of them. Frigates were the eyes of a fleet in the age of sail, the fast scouts that ranged ahead and reported back. Nelson, tasked with finding and destroying the French, had been stripped of his. He was hunting blind across one of the world's largest seas, chasing a ghost armada that could have been headed anywhere from Ireland to India. It was not until the 26th of June, when British forces captured the French frigate Sensible, that the destination was finally revealed. Egypt. They were going to Egypt. By then, the convoy had already crossed the eastern Mediterranean and was bearing down on Alexandria. This is the story of what happened next, and of one single night that unravelled everything Napoleon had built in those bright months of ambition. We will follow his strategic reasoning, the grand gamble he made to sever Britain's reach toward India by seizing Malta and then Egypt itself. We will follow Nelson across those frustrating, fruitless weeks of pursuit, a commander without intelligence, chasing a fleet he kept missing by narrow margins and cruel mischance. We will stand with the French sailors as they anchored in Aboukir Bay, believing themselves protected by shallow shoals and a strong defensive line, not yet understanding that their position contained a fatal flaw. And then we will watch the battle unfold, the audacious British manoeuvre that slipped warships between the French line and the shallows, catching Brueys and his captains in a trap they had not imagined. We will stay through the night as fire took hold of the great French flagship L'Orient, as flames climbed her rigging and reached toward her magazine, and as the explosion that followed stopped both fleets in stunned silence. The cause of that fire remains disputed even now. Stray wadding, paint, a cascade of small accidents leading to catastrophe, and the uncertainty itself feels appropriate, because Lorient's destruction belongs as much to legend as to history. We will trace the consequences forward in time, to the army left stranded in the desert, to the collapse of French ambitions in the East, to the strategic tremors that rippled out across Europe and helped bring about a new coalition against Napoleon. And we will follow the story all the way to the seabed of Aboukir Bay, where modern archaeologists have recovered gold, silver, and fragments of the flagship herself, physical echoes of that night preserved beneath the Mediterranean mud. 400 ships set out from France that May, carrying an empire's dreams eastward. By the time the sun rose on the 2nd of August, 1798, the dream was already dissolving. The army was ashore, the fleet was burning or surrendering or fleeing, and Napoleon, the man who had seemed unstoppable on land, was stranded, isolated from France, cut off from reinforcement, at the mercy of a sea he no longer controlled. It began with a vanishing. It ended with an explosion that echoed across history. To understand why Napoleon pointed 400 ships toward the eastern Mediterranean, you have to understand the peculiar position France found itself in during the summer of 1798. The Treaty of Campo Formio the previous autumn had effectively ended the war on the continent, leaving Austria humbled and the European powers briefly at peace with the French Republic. Briefly, because one nation refused to stop fighting. Britain remained at war with France as it had been since 1793, and it showed no signs of yielding. 2 French attempts to break British sea power had already failed badly, at Cape St Vincent in February of 1797 and at Camperdown that October. The Royal Navy had shattered French and Dutch fleets alike, making a direct channel crossing to invade Britain essentially impossible. The Directory in Paris needed another way to strike, and Napoleon had one. The logic was elegant, at least on paper. Britain's wealth and global power rested in no small part on its trade with India. The East India Company's routes ran through the Red Sea and overland across Egypt, or around the Cape of Good Hope, and both paths depended on Britain's unchallenged reach across the world's oceans. If France could seize Egypt, it would plant itself directly across those eastern trade arteries. Control of the Nile meant control of the most storied corridor between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. There were even discussions among French planners of cutting a canal through the Suez Isthmus, anticipating by 60 years what would eventually become one of the most transformative waterways in history. Egypt was not merely a military target. It was an imperial dream, ancient, prestigious, and strategically placed at the hinge between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Napoleon himself was captivated by the idea in ways that went beyond cold strategy. He had read widely about Alexander the Great's eastern campaigns, about the empires built in the sands between the Nile and the Indus, and he saw in Egypt the kind of mythic conquest that would cement his place among the great commanders of history. The inclusion of the savants, those 167 scientists, engineers, mathematicians, artists, and scholars who sailed alongside the army, tells you everything about how he conceived the expedition. This was not meant to be a raid. It was meant to be a civilization transplanted eastward, a French Enlightenment staking its claim on the ancient world. The scale of what left Toulon on the 19th of May reflected that ambition. 13 ships of the line formed the military corps, accompanied by frigates and more than 400 vessels in total, carrying an army estimated at somewhere between 30,000 and 36,000 men, depending on how the various accounts tally the support staff, engineers, and civilian scholars. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, and some of the finest military talent in France were all aboard. It was the largest French overseas expedition since the wars of Louis XIV, and Napoleon moved through the preparations with the certainty of a man who had never lost a land campaign. That confidence, though, contained a dangerous blind spot. On land, Napoleon's mastery was genuine and deep. At sea, France was in a structurally weaker position than Britain, in experience, in gunnery practice, in the seamanship accumulated through years of sustained naval operations. French naval power had been disrupted by the revolution itself, which had purged or driven into exile much of the officer class that had made the Navy competitive in the American war years earlier. The men who would eventually anchor in Aboukir Bay were capable and courageous, but they were not fighting on the terrain where France held the advantage. Napoleon understood this, at least abstractly, but he believed that speed, secrecy, and the sheer scale of the expedition would carry him to Egypt before the British could respond. Once the army was ashore and the campaign was won on land, the fleet's vulnerability mattered less. The gamble was to get there first, establish control, and then negotiate from strength. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also, as it turned out, catastrophically wrong, not because the army failed to reach Egypt, but because the sea had its own answer waiting in Aboukir Bay. The first obstacle on that road to Egypt was not an enemy fleet. It was a fortress island sitting at the centre of the Mediterranean like a stone stopper in a bottle, and Napoleon moved against it with the same methodical speed he applied to everything. Malta had been held for 268 years by the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, a Catholic military order whose origins stretch back to the Crusades, and whose fortress walls and artillery positions were among the most formidable in Europe. On paper, the island should have taken months to reduce. Napoleon gave it 3 days. On the 10th of June 1798, French forces landed simultaneously at 4 points around the coastline, overwhelming the Maltese defenders at every approach. By the 12th, the Grand Master had agreed to terms and the tricolour was flying over Valletta. The speed of the capitulation surprised even the French, though in retrospect the outcome was less shocking than it seemed. The Hospitaller order was hollowed out by the time Napoleon arrived, riven by internal disputes, financially weakened, and staffed by officers whose loyalties were divided between the order and the French Republic, from which many of them had come. The fortifications were impressive, but the men inside them were not prepared for the kind of concentrated assault Napoleon's army delivered. When the gates opened, France found itself in possession of a staggering haul: 1,200 artillery pieces, the small Maltese navy, the order's stores of ammunition and supplies, and a treasury built over centuries. The end of Hospitaller rule on Malta came with a kind of anticlimactic finality, as though the institution had simply run out of time, but the strategic meaning of what France had just taken was anything but anticlimactic. Malta sat almost equidistant between Gibraltar and the Levantine coast, offering the deepest natural harbour in the central Mediterranean, and a coaling and resupply position that commanded the sea lanes in every direction. Whoever held it could threaten Sicily, monitor the Adriatic, and project force toward Egypt, Greece, or North Africa with equal ease. For Britain, which had long counted on Malta's neutrality as a buffer, and which maintained close ties to the Catholic order that had held it, the island's fall into French hands was alarming in ways that extended well beyond immediate military calculations. It signalled that France intended to stay in the Mediterranean as a permanent naval power, not merely pass through it. Napoleon left 4,000 troops under General Vaubois to hold the new acquisition, then turned the rest of the armada southeast and gave the order to sail for Egypt. He could not afford to linger. Somewhere out in the Mediterranean, he knew, a British squadron was searching for him. The fleet that left Malta, departing somewhere around the 19th of June, though some French naval logs suggest the 16th, the discrepancy reflecting the chaos of coordinating 400 ships and a mid-campaign garrison handover, was a spectacle unlike anything the Mediterranean had seen in a generation. At its heart moved the great warships, 13 ships of the line including the enormous L'Orient, a 120-gun three-decker that served as Admiral Brueys' flagship, and was among the largest warships afloat in the world. Around them sailed frigates and corvettes, and stretching out in a long column that took hours to pass any given point, nearly 400 transports and supply vessels carrying soldiers, horses, artillery trains, and the extraordinary civilian corps of savants with their instruments, books, and specimen cases, the logistics of moving such a force across open water were punishing. The transports were merchant vessels pressed into military service, many of them slow and poorly rigged, requiring the warships to reduce sail constantly to keep the convoy together. The soldiers aboard suffered in the summer heat below decks, short on fresh water and crowded into spaces designed for cargo. Horses fared even worse. Artillery pieces and ammunition shifted in heavy weather. The whole armada moved at the speed of its weakest vessel, which was never fast enough for Napoleon's impatience, and the long column made concealment nearly impossible. If any British frigate had stumbled across them in open water, the convoy's position would have been reported within hours. To prevent exactly that, Admiral Brueys gave orders that any merchant vessel encountered along the route was to be seized and detained, its crew kept aboard the French ships until the destination was safely reached. False intelligence had been circulated before the fleet left Toulon, suggesting the expedition might be heading for Sicily, for Ireland, or for some target along the Spanish coast. British agents and diplomats from Naples to Lisbon passed along contradictory fragments of information, none of it conclusive, all of it designed to keep London and its admirals guessing while the convoy pushed eastward through the summer sea. It very nearly worked. The fleet passed south of Sardinia, rounded the western approaches to the central basin, and made for Crete without any meaningful encounter with British warships. By the 30th of June, the convoy was off Crete, and by the morning of the 1st of July, the low coast of Egypt had appeared on the horizon. Alexandria lay just ahead. What greeted the French was not the leisurely harbour entry they might have hoped for. A small brig went in first to secure the anchorage, and then the troops began transferring from the transport vessels into smaller landing craft to be rowed ashore at Mirabeau Creek west of the city. The surf that morning was rough, the boats heavily laden, and the operation was pressed forward with more urgency than caution. Several boats capsized in the breaking waves. Between 20 and 40 French soldiers drowned in the shallows within sight of the African coast. The precise number varies between contemporary accounts, and other equipment was lost. It was an inauspicious beginning, the sea offering its first small reminder that this campaign would demand more than it had been given. But the landing was also essentially unopposed. The Ottoman garrison at Alexandria was small and unprepared, and the city fell quickly. Napoleon was ashore, his army was on Egyptian soil, and the land campaign he had planned across months of study and ambition could finally begin. The desert stretched south toward Cairo and the Nile. The pyramids waited somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon. What he left behind him, however, was already becoming a problem. The French fleet, too large and too deep in draft to enter Alexandria's harbour in full strength, had anchored at Aboukir Bay, some 15 miles to the northeast. There Admiral Brueys waited, uncertain of his next orders, uncertain of the intentions of the British fleet that intelligence suggested was somewhere in the same sea, and increasingly uncomfortable with the exposed position his ships occupied along that low sandy shore. He had ships enough to fight a battle and supplies sufficient for a few weeks. What he lacked was any certainty about what would happen next. The army had arrived, the ships were waiting, and somewhere behind them, still moving through that same blue water, a British admiral with a burned eye and a reputation for relentless aggression was closing the distance with every hour of favouring wind. Admiral Nelson had been chasing a ghost for weeks, before he even knew the ghost had a name. He'd sailed from Gibraltar on the 8th of May, 1798, flying his flag in the 74-gun Vanguard and leading a small squadron into a Mediterranean that offered almost no reliable intelligence about where the French expedition was headed or what it intended. His orders were to find the armament and report its destination. His resources were thin. 3 ships of the line and a handful of accompanying vessels supplemented by 3 frigates whose speed and range would be essential to scouting ahead of the slower, heavier warships. The frigates were his eyes. Without them, a ship of the line searching the Mediterranean for a hidden fleet was like a man trying to find a single letter in a vast, dark library, capable of moving methodically from shelf to shelf, but fundamentally blind to what lay around the corners. The gale came on the 21st of May, and it took his eyes away. It struck with the sudden violence that the western Mediterranean occasionally produces in spring, when cold northern air meets the warm surface of the inland sea and the transition produces something very close to a tempest. Vanguard was dismasted, her foremast gone, her rigging in ruin, her flagship dignity stripped away by a storm that cared nothing for Admiralty commissions. The 3 frigates, separated in the chaos and receiving no signal from the crippled flagship through the darkness and the weather, made the decision that was technically correct by naval protocol and strategically catastrophic in practice. They withdrew to Gibraltar, assuming Nelson would do the same. He would not. He had Vanguard patched and rigged under jury masts within a matter of days, a feat of seamanship that reflected the quality of his crew more than it resolved his fundamental problem. The frigates were gone. They would not return. And the French Armada, meanwhile, was somewhere at sea. Nelson wrote in his letters with a kind of controlled anguish about what that loss meant. He called it the want of frigates. He used the phrase again and again in his correspondence with Sir William Hamilton at Naples and with his wife back in England, not as an excuse, but as an explanation that he knew history would need in order to understand the shape of the pursuit that followed. Without frigates to range ahead and report, he was forced to use his ships of the line for reconnaissance, vessels that drew too much water to approach certain coasts, that moved too slowly to pursue anything that spotted them first, and that consumed his fighting strength every time he detached one to look around a headland or investigate a distant sail. He was a fleet commander operating without the one tool that navies of the age depended on for strategic awareness, hunting an enemy that had deliberately created a fog of misdirection around its movements. The pursuit that followed covered more than 1,500 nautical miles and stretched across 73 days that mixed grim determination with something close to the maddening frustration of a dream in which you can see your destination, but never quite reach it. He stopped at Malta, arriving just after the French had left, the island already in their hands, the Hospitaller order already dissolved, the tricolour already flying over Valletta's ancient walls. He moved to Naples, where British diplomats gave him fragments of intelligence suggesting Egypt, then doubled east past Sicily and down toward the Gulf of Coron on the Greek coast, where Ottoman officials confirmed that a massive French fleet had passed through the eastern Mediterranean heading south. The picture was assembling itself, but always just behind the French position, always slightly late. The near misses were the part that gave the whole pursuit its ghost-like quality. On the 22nd of June, with his squadron cutting southeast through waters he believed the French must have recently crossed. Lookouts reported strange sails on the horizon. The shapes were consistent with frigates, French frigates, almost certainly, part of Brueys' escort screen. The British gave chase, but the other ships were faster and the light was fading, and by the time darkness settled fully over the sea, the strange sails had dissolved into it and were gone. Nelson could not know for certain what he had seen. He could not know how close he might have been to the edges of the convoy itself, hidden further south in the same darkness. The French Armada and the British squadron may have moved through the same quadrant of sea within hours of each other that night, passing like ships in the literal dark. On the 30th of June, pushing toward Alexandria on the strength of intelligence that suggested the French had gone there, he arrived at the harbour to find it empty. No fleet, no transports, no sign that 400 ships had recently been in these waters at all. The disappointment was profound enough to shake lesser men. Nelson pressed his ships back out to sea and began reconsidering everything. Perhaps he had been wrong about Egypt. Perhaps the French had turned for some other destination, while he had been racing east. He spent days working back through the eastern basin, questioning every merchant captain he could intercept, gathering fragments of rumour and report from British consuls at Levantine ports, piecing together a picture from sources that contradicted each other as often as they agreed. What he could not have known was that the French fleet had arrived at Alexandria only hours after he had left it. He had been early. He had crossed the sea too fast, outpacing the slower convoy, arrived before it and departed before it showed. The pursuit that felt like a failure was, in its mechanics, a pursuit that had nearly succeeded in its own way, and the near miss was so exact, so precise in its timing, that it strains the imagination even knowing it to be true. It was not until the 28th of July that his scouts finally found confirmation of French ships at Alexandria, and by then the fleet had already moved to its anchorage at Aboukir Bay. Nelson turned for Egypt one more time, with the same grinding determination that had carried him across 1,500 miles of sea without ever sighting the enemy's main force. He was tired. His captains were tired. The ships had been at sea for months, their stores running low, their rigging repaired and repaired again. But the exhaustion had done something to the squadron that perhaps only a long and frustrating pursuit could do. It had made them impatient for resolution. The captains who had gathered around Nelson's table during those weeks of uncertainty, who had listened to him explain his reasoning and share his intelligence and absorb his relentless confidence that the French were somewhere ahead and must be found, had been formed by those conversations into something unusually cohesive. Nelson called them his band of brothers, borrowing the phrase from Shakespeare, and by the time they finally sighted the coast of Egypt again on the 1st of August 1798, they had earned it. They understood what he intended before he signalled it. They were ready to fight the moment the French anchorage came into view. The hunt had been difficult precisely because the frigates were gone, but the hunt had also created something. 73 days of shared uncertainty, shared frustration and shared purpose had turned a collection of ship's captains into a command that operated almost as a single instrument. Whatever battle waited for them in that bay, they would enter it with an understanding of each other that no brief campaign could have produced. The bay appeared. The French fleet lay at anchor in a long curving line beside the shoals. The chase was over. What came next would be far shorter, far louder, and far more decisive than anything that had preceded it. Before Nelson turned his squadron back toward Egypt that final time, Napoleon had already won. The army that had crossed the Mediterranean in secret, sealed inside hundreds of transports, and protected by the same fog of uncertainty that had maddened Nelson for weeks, had landed on Egyptian soil and moved with a speed and violence that the defenders could not match. Alexandria fell on the 2nd of July, taken in a morning assault that cracked the city's medieval walls before the Mamluk garrison could organise a coherent resistance. The French had barely paused to consolidate before pushing south and west into the interior, driving into a landscape of brutal heat and disorienting flatness that killed horses and exhausted even the most disciplined infantry. Soldiers wrote home about a country that seemed designed to punish Europeans. The sun relentless, the water scarce, the sand working its way into every mechanism and every wound. They had traded the cool Atlantic and Mediterranean for something that felt, to men from Normandy and Provence and Alsace, like the surface of another world entirely. The Mamluks came to meet them in the desert, and on the 21st of July 1798, the two forces collided within sight of the pyramids at Giza, those ancient monuments standing against the horizon like something so old and impersonal that the battle playing out beneath them seemed almost inconsequential by comparison. It was not inconsequential. The Mamluk cavalry, brilliant horsemen who had ruled Egypt for centuries, through a combination of skill, ferocity and political dominance, charged the French squares with everything they had. The squares held. The French artillery, methodically positioned at the corners of the infantry formations, tore through the repeated charges with a geometric efficiency that left the battlefield strewn with men and horses, while the French formations barely wavered. By the end of the day, the Mamluks had lost somewhere close to 3,000 men. The French counted roughly 30 dead and 300 wounded. Numbers so lopsided they read more like a military exercise than a genuine engagement. Napoleon was master of Egypt within weeks of landing. By any conventional measure of a land campaign, the expedition had succeeded. Cairo was occupied, the Mamluk ruling class was shattered or scattered into the desert, and the French administration began the work of governing a country of millions, while a small army of scientists, scholars and engineers that had accompanied the expedition started cataloguing antiquities, mapping the Nile Delta, and laying the intellectual groundwork for what would eventually become the Napoleonic Description de l'Égypte, a monumental survey that would, decades later, give Western Europe its first systematic encounter with the depth and complexity of ancient Egyptian civilization. Even in the deserts around Cairo, the expedition was producing something that would outlast every battle that defined it. But the sea was another matter entirely. While Napoleon consolidated his hold on Egypt's cities and river crossings, Admiral François-Paul Brueys de Gallier faced a problem that had no clean military solution. The fleet that had carried the army across the Mediterranean, 13 ships of the line, 4 frigates, and the supply vessels that had been dismissed or sent back, was now sitting in exposed water with nowhere obvious to go and no set of orders that told it what to do next. Napoleon had taken the army ashore. The army no longer needed the fleet to carry it, but the fleet could not simply dissolve, and it could not return to Toulon without risking interception by a Royal Navy that was now increasingly aware of where the French had gone. Brueys needed an anchorage he could defend, a position from which the fleet could sustain itself and perhaps support the army's operations along the coast. Alexandria had seemed the obvious answer, but the harbour had defeated him on inspection. The port that Alexander the Great had built to dominate Mediterranean commerce was simply too shallow for the deeper drafted ships of the line in his command. The largest French vessels, including the enormous 120-gun flagship L'Orient, drew too much water to cross the bar into the inner harbour safely. Moving into Alexandria would have meant either leaving his heavier ships outside in the open roadstead, more exposed than any anchorage further east, or stripping them of guns and stores to lighten them enough to enter, a process that would take weeks and leave the fleet temporarily disarmed during its most vulnerable period. Neither option was acceptable. Brueys looked east along the coast for an alternative and found Aboukir Bay. On the map, and to an eye accustomed to reading anchorages, Aboukir looked defensible. The bay curved in a broad arc roughly 20 miles east of Alexandria, its western end defined by a low sandy peninsula and the small elevation of Aboukir Island, which mounted a battery of its own. The northern end of the bay opened to the sea, but the approach from that direction was complicated by shoals, shallow banks of sand and sediment that stretched out from the shore at irregular intervals, creating a navigational puzzle for any enemy fleet attempting to work its way in under fire. Brueys anchored his line of 13 ships of the line running roughly southwest to northeast, with the van tucked close against the shoals near Bakir Island, the centre and rear stretching out in a sequence that appeared to leave an attacker with only one viable approach. From the north, moving down the line from the van, fighting one ship at a time while the whole formation could concentrate fire on the approaching vessels. The island battery covered the western approach, the shoals covered the landward side, the fleet's guns covered everything else. Brueys concluded that no competent enemy admiral would attempt to come at him through the shallows between the line and the shore, and that a direct approach from seaward would allow the French to engage on terms they could manage. What he did not resolve, and perhaps could not resolve given the limitations of his anchorage, was the question of the gaps. The ships in his line were spaced at intervals sufficient to allow each vessel to swing freely on its anchor as the tide and wind shifted, a necessary precaution that nevertheless meant the line was not a continuous wall of timber and gunmetal, but a series of separate floating fortresses with water between them. More critically, because Brueys expected any attack to come from seaward, the guns on the ship's landward sides, the port batteries, were left unready, their gun ports closed, their crews unassigned to stations. The assumption that no one would come from the shoal side was so embedded in the French tactical thinking that the landward half of the fleet was effectively disarmed when the British appeared. The expedition that had crossed the Mediterranean in secret, that had taken Alexandria in a morning and broken the Mamluks in an afternoon, that had planted the tricolour over Cairo and begun the systematic study of one of the world's oldest civilizations, now depended for its future on whether that assumption would hold. Napoleon could control every road in Egypt and every crossing of the Nile and still be stranded without the sea. His army needed supplies that could only come by ship. It needed reinforcements that could only come by ship. Any withdrawal, if withdrawal ever became necessary, would require ships. The land campaign and the naval anchorage were not separate problems. They were the same problem, separated by 20 miles of desert and the very different expertise required to solve each of them. Napoleon had proved himself the master of the first. What happened in Aboukir Bay would determine whether any of it mattered, and anchored in that deceptively quiet water, with his portside guns unstocked and his formation riddled with gaps he had judged too shallow to exploit, Brueys was waiting for a decision that was no longer his to make. Aboukir Bay on the 1st of August 1798 was a place that could deceive you if you let it. From the open sea to the north, looking south into the bay, the water appeared broad and calm, a generous crescent of sheltered water perhaps 16 nautical miles wide, its far shore low and sandy and dissolving into heat haze by midday. The coastline curved gently, offering none of the dramatic headlands or rocky promontories that announced danger clearly. The light in late afternoon was the particular golden quality of the Egyptian summer, flattening distances and softening edges, making the water look deeper and the seabed further away than they actually were. It was the kind of anchorage that invited confidence. It also concealed its hazards in plain sight. The bay's western end was defined by a low sandy peninsula, and just beyond it the small rise of Aboukir Island, which French engineers had fitted with a shore battery. From there, stretching roughly northeast for several miles, ran the shoals, irregular banks of sand and sediment accumulated over centuries by the currents and the Nile's distributaries, lying in water that in places reached no deeper than 4 fathoms, about 8 meters, and in others was shallower still. For a deep-draughted ship of the line, these banks were an absolute boundary. A vessel drawing 5 or 6 meters in calm water could find herself aground in a matter of minutes if she drifted too close, held fast on a sandbank in enemy-controlled waters with no possibility of rescue. The shoals were not walls you could see, but they were walls nonetheless, and Brueys had built his entire defensive calculation around them. He anchored his 13 ships of the line along the northeastern edge of the shoal system, their line running roughly southwest to northeast, with the van, led by the 74-gun Guerrier, positioned at the shoal's northern tip and the flagship Lorient sitting heavily in the centre of the formation. Behind her, the line extended toward the open sea with the remaining ships stretching to the rear. It was, in principle, an elegant defensive geometry. An attacker approaching from the north would have to come down the line ship by ship, fighting each vessel in sequence, while the entire French formation could maintain its broadsides aimed outward to sea. The island battery covered the southwestern approach. The shoals covered the landward side. Brueys had on paper created a position that an attacking fleet could only assault from a single, predictable direction. But the line was not solid, and this was the detail that would undo everything. Each ship needed room to swing on her anchor cable as the wind and tide shifted through the evening hours, and so Brueys had spaced his vessels at intervals of approximately 150 to 160 yards. Estimates vary slightly between sources, but the effect was consistent. Between each pair of French ships lay a gap of open water wide enough and deep enough for a British 74 to thread through under sail. These gaps were a practical necessity. They were also, as the British would shortly demonstrate, an invitation. And if that were not vulnerability enough, there was the question of the portside guns. Because Brueys expected any attack to come from seaward, the batteries on the landward side of his ships, the portsides facing the shoals, had been left in a state of effective unreadiness. The gun ports were closed. The guns were not run out. In several ships, the portside decks were still cluttered with stores, barrels and equipment that had not been properly stowed during the weeks the fleet had spent at anchor. Some accounts suggest the gun crews on those sides had not even been assigned to their stations. The logic behind this was straightforward. If no rational attacker would approach from the shoal side, there was no need to maintain combat readiness on that side. The threat was seaward. The port batteries were, in practical terms, dormant. By the time the British squadron was sighted in the late afternoon of the 1st of August, the French crews had been at anchor for more than 2 weeks. Some parties were ashore on the island and along the coast foraging for provisions and fresh water, and there was a period of confusion about whether to recall them before battle or leave that task for later. Brueys initially believed the British might delay their attack until morning. Naval engagements in confined, shoal-ridden waters after dark were generally considered reckless, and he may have expected Nelson to heave to overnight and reassess. It was a reasonable assumption based on conventional practice. It was wrong. The sun began to drop toward the desert horizon at roughly 6:30 in the evening, and the quality of the light changed as the day's fierce glare softened into the amber and purple of a Mediterranean summer dusk. The northeasterly breeze that had been blowing steadily through the day continued, carrying the smell of salt and sand, and it carried something else too. The approaching British squadron, working its way down toward the bay's entrance with a purpose that was becoming unmistakable. To picture the French position as it stood in those final minutes before the battle opened. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship anchored at the approximate centre of Aboukir Bay, facing north toward the open sea. The water around you is calm, tinted amber by the declining sun. To your left, to the west, the shoals lie somewhere beneath the surface, invisible but absolute, their presence marked only by the slightly different texture of the water above them and the pale sand visible when the sun catches the seabed at the right angle. To your right and ahead, the sea opens toward the Mediterranean horizon, and it is from that direction that the enemy is coming. A line of British ships growing steadily larger, their sails full in the northeasterly wind, their gun ports, on the seaward side, already opening. Behind you, along the curve of the bay toward the northeast, the rest of the French line stretches out in sequence, ship after ship at their measured intervals, their starboard guns run out and trained seaward, their port guns still closed against the shoals. The gaps between each vessel are wide enough to walk a frigate through. The flagship Lorient, 120 guns, sits enormous and heavy in the water, her red and black sides reflecting in the bay. She is the most powerful single warship in the Mediterranean, and she is anchored. That last detail mattered more than almost anything else. An anchored ship cannot maneuver. She cannot turn to present a different face to her enemy, cannot bear away to open distance, cannot close with a damaged opponent or retreat from an overwhelming one. She can only fire from where she sits, in the direction her guns are pointed, and trust that the enemy will cooperate by remaining on the side she is prepared to receive them. Brueys had prepared for an attack from the sea. He had not prepared, truly prepared, in the sense of loaded guns and cleared decks and station crews, for an attack from the shoals. The gap between the Guerrier and the bank of sand to her landward side was wider than anyone on the French line appears to have fully reckoned. It was deep enough, and in the fading light of an Egyptian evening, with the northeasterly filling their sails, several British captains looked at that gap, looked at the undefended port sides of the French van, and made a decision that Brueys had staked everything on them not making. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, the lookout aboard HMS Zealous called down what the rest of the squadron had been searching for across weeks of frustration and misdirection. To the south, beyond the low headland, lay a forest of masts, dozens of them, still and vertical against the Egyptian sky, rising from the hulls of the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. The news passed from ship to ship through signal flags and shouted confirmation, and within minutes Horatio Nelson knew that the chase was over. He had been hunting this fleet since June, crossing and recrossing the eastern Mediterranean with a persistence that bordered on obsession, receiving contradictory intelligence at every port, and twice missing the French by margins that seemed almost cruel in retrospect. He had overhauled them on the run to Alexandria, arrived before them, and found the harbour empty, sailed away, and allowed the French to slip in behind him. He had lost his frigates, the fast scouting vessels that should have served as his eyes. Early in the pursuit, a misfortune that had forced him to navigate on intuition and second-hand reports for most of the summer. And now, on the 1st of August, approaching the low, sandy coastline east of Alexandria, his patience was finally rewarded in the most unambiguous way possible. The question he faced in those first minutes after the sighting was not whether to fight, but when. Convention argued for morning. Every experienced officer in the squadron understood the standard calculation. Attacking an anchored fleet in a bay of unknown depth, with shoals charted imprecisely at best, and not at all in some sections, as darkness gathered, was the kind of decision that courts-martial were built around. The northeasterly wind was carrying his ships toward the bay's entrance at a good rate of progress, but good progress into poorly understood water after 4 o'clock in the afternoon meant fighting in failing light and then full darkness. The French had been in position for weeks. They had taken soundings, placed buoys, and oriented their entire defensive formation with reference to the shoal's edges. Nelson had no accurate charts. His pilots had never entered Aboukir Bay. The risk of losing ships to grounding before a single gun was fired was entirely real, and it was the kind of risk that a more cautious admiral, perhaps a wiser one in the strictly technical sense, would have declined. Nelson did not decline it. His reasoning, communicated with characteristic brevity, was this: the northwesterly wind that was now in his favour could not be counted on to hold through the night and into the following morning. To wait was to surrender the initiative and hand Brueys the hours of darkness to strengthen his position, recall his foraging parties, clear his port-side gun decks, and perhaps receive reinforcements from Alexandria. Every hour the French fleet remained intact, and in place was an hour in which the strategic situation that had stranded Napoleon's army in Egypt might somehow be retrieved. Nelson had not spent the summer in pursuit of a fleet he intended to observe politely from a respectful distance. He signalled the order to prepare for battle and bore down into the bay. The light was already beginning its decline toward the long Egyptian dusk, and the water ahead was a shifting, deceptive bronze as the squadron rounded the headland, and the full extent of the French line came into view. 13 ships of the line in their anchored row, the monstrous bulk of Lorient distinguishable even at distance by her sheer mass, the whole formation presenting its starboard broadsides to the approaching British. To any captain in Nelson's squadron, the geometry was visible and the implications were immediate. The French had prepared one face of their defensive line. Between that line and the shoals to the landward side there were gaps wide enough and, critically, potentially deep enough to allow a ship of the line to pass through and reach the undefended port side of each French vessel. The man who acted first on this was Captain Thomas Foley of HMS Goliath, sailing in the van of the British squadron. Foley had managed to obtain a French atlas that contained a rough chart of the bay, and he had spent the approach studying the margins of the shoals with the practised attention of a captain who had spent his career learning to trust depth reading over assumption. As Goliath reached the northern tip of the French line, where the 74-gun Guerrier lay at anchor as the lead ship of Brueys' formation, Foley made his turn. He took Goliath inside the line, between the French ships and the shoal, accepting the risk of running aground on the hidden sandbanks in exchange for bringing his guns to bear on the side of the enemy that was entirely unprepared to receive them. It was a decision of considerable audacity. The bottom beneath Goliath's keel was unknown. The gap between the Guerrier and the shoal was real, but its precise width was a judgment call made at speed in deteriorating light. A miscalculation of a few yards could have put Goliath hard aground before she fired a shot, transforming a bold manoeuvre into a catastrophe and perhaps discouraging the ships behind her from following. Foley accepted all of this and held his course. What happened next illustrated something fundamental about the way Nelson had shaped his squadron during the long months of pursuit and waiting. He had not drilled his captains in a rigid sequence of prearranged signals. He had instead gathered them, his band of brothers, as he would later call them in one of naval history's most resonant phrases, around his table and talked through possibilities and principles until every captain understood not merely what orders they were likely to receive, but what Nelson intended and why. When Goliath went inside the line, the captains of Zealous, Orion and Audacious did not wait for instruction. They read the opening, trusted the tactic and followed. Within the span of a few minutes, multiple British ships were pressing through the gaps in the French formation to take position on the landward side, while the rest of Nelson's squadron continued down the seaward face of the line, bringing the French vanguard under fire from both sides simultaneously. The French were not ready for this. Brueys had allowed his defensive logic to harden into assumption, and the assumption had been that no rational commander would attempt an anchored line's landward side in these conditions. The portside gun decks of the French van were cluttered and unmanned. Some of the crew parties were still ashore. The elegant geometry of the position, shoals on one side, open sea on the other, the whole line mutually supporting, required only one thing to remain intact: that the British should cooperate with it by attacking from the predicted direction. The sun continued its descent toward the desert horizon as the British squadron came on, the northeasterly filling their sails with the particular steady insistence of a wind that has made up its mind. The water of the bay was changing colour by the minute, the golden afternoon light deepening into amber, and then into the first suggestion of rose and violet along the western edge of the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the shore battery on Aboukir Island began to fire, ineffectively at this range, the shot falling short, and the sound of it rolled across the bay like the opening note of something much larger. Nelson's ships were still closing. The gaps in the French line were ahead of them, visible now between the dark hulls of the anchored enemy vessels. The port sides of the Guerrier, the Conquerant, the Spartiate lay dark and unprepared, their unlit gun ports closed against a threat their admiral had judged impossible. The last light of the 1st of August was draining out of the Egyptian sky, and the battle that would change the course of a war was about to begin. Goliath's guns opened the battle from a position the French had declared impossible. Captain Foley came around the northern end of the French line with the soundings coming up reassuringly from his leadsman, and the dark hull of the Guerrier filling his larboard view at steadily shortening range. He did not anchor immediately. Instead, he allowed Goliath to slide along the landward face of the French van, raking the bow of the Guerrier as he passed. A raking shot fired into the unprotected bow or stern of a ship of the line was among the most devastating things a cannon could deliver. It travelled the full length of the gun deck without meeting a transverse bulkhead, clearing men from their stations in a single stroke. The Guerrière's crew had had almost no time to respond, and the response they could manage was compromised from the start. Their portside guns were either not cleared or not fully prepared, and the crews working those pieces had until moments ago believed they were facing nothing more dangerous than a long afternoon of waiting. Foley carried on and brought Goliath to anchor abreast of the Conquerant, the second ship in the French line. Behind him, the captains of Zealous, Orion, Audacious, and Theseus made their own independent calculations and followed him inside. Each of those decisions involved the same compressed arithmetic of risk: the depth of the water beneath the keel, the width of the gap between the French hull and the shoal's edge, the state of the light, the possibility that one of them might ground and block the passage for those behind. In each case, the captain held his course. What made this sequence possible was not a signal from Nelson ordering the manoeuvre. No signal could have communicated the necessary precision in time, and no prearranged flag code covered this precise contingency. What made it possible was something less formal and considerably more valuable: a shared understanding of purpose built over months of discussion, and a collective confidence in reading a tactical opening when it appeared. Foley went through the gap and the others followed because they all recognised, independently and almost simultaneously, that the gap was real, that the French could not cover the shoreward side in time, and that the moment would not survive hesitation. The seamanship involved in this passage was exceptional in ways that can be obscured by describing it purely in terms of tactics. Navigating a 74-gun ship of the line through shallow water of uncertain depth, in deteriorating afternoon light, with combat imminent on the other side, demanded a quality of ship handling that had been trained into these crews through years of sea time. The leadsman at the bow calling depths, the officers at the con translating those numbers into adjustments, of course, the helmsman responding with the precision necessary to thread a gap that had perhaps 100 yards of margin on the shoal side and a French broadside on the other. None of this was abstract. It was craft, accumulated and practiced, and it was this craft as much as any written plan that broke the French line. Meanwhile, Nelson's vanguard and the ships that had not yet passed inside the line continued their approach down the seaward face of the French formation. The result was the doubling that would be studied by naval officers for decades afterward. The French van was simultaneously engaged from landward by Foley's group and from seaward by Nelson's, each French vessel caught between two opponents who had every advantage of surprise and preparation. The British captains had pre-rigged their anchor cables to run through forward gun ports so they could be brought up short and anchored quickly beside their chosen opponent, a detail of preparation that allowed them to take station precisely and maintain a steady, concentrated fire rather than drifting and losing the positional advantage they had worked so hard to achieve. The Guerrière, struck first, bore the intensity of the opening assault from multiple ships in succession, as each British vessel passed her during the approach. Within the first 30 minutes she was effectively dismasted, her topmasts and then her mainmast coming down in the rolling broadside fire that the British gun crews, trained to fire rapidly and maintain a high rate of shot, delivered with a relentlessness that gave the French no interval in which to recover their footing. The Conquérant followed quickly. Both ships of the French van surrendered within the first hour. Among the French crews, the shock of attack from the shoreward direction was not merely tactical, it was psychological in its intensity. A defensive position carries with it a particular kind of reassurance. A ship at anchor has chosen its ground. The officers have taken soundings, assessed the angles, decided what the enemy can and cannot do. For the captains of the French van, the decision that no ship of the line could safely navigate the passage between their position and the shoals was not a hope or an assumption in any careless sense. It was a professional judgment based on the available information. And it was wrong. The moment British hulls appeared on the shoreward side, the entire spatial logic of the defensive formation inverted. The side that had faced towards safety, toward the shoals, toward the shore, toward the direction from which no threat was expected, was now the side from which fire was arriving. The portside gun decks that had been used for storage, that had crew parties still returning from shore, that had been treated as an interior wall rather than a fighting face, were suddenly the most urgent problem on the ship. Some French crews responded with discipline and courage despite everything. Several of the ships in the van fought both sides simultaneously, rotating their men between gun ports and accepting terrible casualties to do so. But the initial minutes of confusion had cost them dearly. In those first exchanges, when the British were loading their guns for a second and third time and finding their range with the practiced efficiency of crews who had spent months at sea maintaining their readiness, the French were still organising their response to a situation their captains had told them would not happen. The light continued to fade over Aboukir Bay as the gunfire spread south along the French line. The smoke from the guns was already beginning to obscure the ships in the van, the grey-white banks of it hanging low over the water in the still evening air and catching the last of the day's colour in a way that one later account described as almost beautiful, in the way that terrible things sometimes briefly appear at the moment they arrive before the understanding of them catches up. The flashes of the guns pulsed through the smoke in irregular rhythms, and the sound of them reached the shore in waves, too rapid and continuous to resolve into individual shots. Captain Foley's Goliath, the ship that had started all of this, sat at anchor beside the Conqueror and continued to fire. The bower cable bent through the forward gun port had held her precisely in station, and her crew worked the guns with a concentrated, systematic intensity of men who understood that speed and accuracy in the next 30 minutes would determine whether the manoeuvre that had placed them here ended in victory or disaster. The ships that had followed them through the gap took their own stations in sequence. The doubling manoeuvre was complete, and the French van was burning from both sides. Behind the collapsing van, further down the French line toward the massive central shape of Lorient, the battle was only just beginning to arrive, but the battle in the north had already decided something. The defensive geometry that Admiral Brueys had constructed with such apparent care over the week since the fleet had anchored here had taken perhaps 40 minutes to unravel, undone not by any single act of genius, but by the accumulated weight of expert seamanship, prepared captains, and the willingness of one man in the lead ship to take a gap that everyone else had been told was not there. The guns did not pause when the light went out. By 7 o'clock in the evening, darkness had settled across Aboukir Bay, in the way it does in the eastern Mediterranean in early August, quickly, completely, without the long twilight that a northern sailor might expect. The French van was already broken. The Guerrier and the Conquérant had surrendered within the first hour, their masts down and their gun decks wrecked, and the British ships that had overwhelmed them were already shifting their fire south along the line toward the Spartiate, the Aquilon, and the vessels beyond. The battle had not slowed with the darkness. It had changed its character. What replaced daylight was something stranger and more disorienting, a world defined entirely by sound and the brief, violent illumination of gun muzzles. Each broadside threw a wall of orange light across the water for a fraction of a second, just long enough to stamp the outline of a ship onto the eye before the smoke swallowed everything again. The intervals between those flashes were absolute blackness, filled with the continuous rolling thunder of the guns, the shriek of shot through rigging, the deeper concussive weight of a ship taking hits below its waterline timbers. Accounts from survivors on both sides reach for similar language. The roar that never quite stopped, the way the sound pressed against the body as much as the ears, the strange intimacy of not being able to see the ship you were destroying, or the ship that was destroying you. The gun smoke was the defining physical fact of a night naval engagement. It did not disperse in the still evening air. It gathered, ships that had been firing for an hour were surrounded by clouds of it, thick enough that gun crews on the upper decks could barely see the flash of the ship opposite, and those below the waterline could see nothing at all except the lit faces of the men around them and the dull orange glow of the slow matches. Officers navigated by memory and compass bearing, by the sound of the enemy's guns and the direction of incoming shot. The bay had become a map of fire and noise, and within that map each ship existed in its own small circle of terrible clarity, while everything beyond remained opaque. Within this soundscape the battle moved with a logic that was methodical on the British side and increasingly desperate on the French. The ships that had passed inside the line, Foley's Goliath, Zealous, Orion, Theseus, continued to hammer the French van from the landward side, their cables holding them in exact position beside their chosen opponents. From the seaward face, Nelson's vanguard and the ships following behind pressed in against the same vessels from the opposite direction. The French ships caught in the van were being worked on from both sides simultaneously, their crews divided between two gun decks facing two different enemies, their casualty rate rising with each exchange. The Spartiate, third in the French line, fought both sides for the better part of 2 hours before she was reduced to silence. It was during the engagement with the Spartiate that Nelson went down. He was on the quarter-deck of Vanguard, as close to the centre of the action as a man could reasonably be, when something struck him across the forehead. A musket ball, a piece of iron, a fragment of chain shot, depending on which contemporary account you follow, and the force of it threw him back and opened a wound that bled immediately and heavily across the one eye that still served him. The blow stunned him badly enough that for a moment his officers thought he had been killed. He was carried below to the surgeon's quarters, where the operating tables were already occupied, and the candlelight barely reached the deckhead. The wound was serious enough that the surgeon who examined it feared for the eye, possibly for Nelson's life. Nelson refused to wait. He dictated a message to the captain of the fleet during the minutes the surgeon worked on him, and when the dressing was applied he was back on the quarter-deck. Before the battle had moved much further down the line, the wound continued to bleed freely, and the strip of cloth over his forehead gave him an appearance that those around him recalled afterward with some consistency. Pale, determined, half-blinded, directing the fire of his ships with the same focused economy of language he had used when he was unhurt. The fact that the commanding admiral was visibly wounded and visibly present communicated something to the men around him that no order could have communicated as efficiently. While Nelson resumed his position on Vanguard, the destruction of the French centre was proceeding through the same cause and effect that had already consumed the van. Each ship that bore the concentrated fire of multiple British opponents for long enough was silenced, not always quickly, not always without cost to the attackers, but inevitably. HMS Bellerophon, which had engaged the massive French flagship Lorient on her own, paid a severe price for the attempt. The disparity in broadside weight between a 74 and 120 gunship was not one that seamanship or courage could easily compensate, and Bellerophon was battered into a drifting wreck before other British ships could come to her support. She lost more men that night than almost any other ship in the fleet. But the pattern held. The ships of the French van had surrendered by midnight. The centre was engaged on both faces, with the French gun crews maintaining a resistance that contemporary British accounts acknowledged as fierce and disciplined even in the face of a situation that had become strategically hopeless within the first hour. The French captains and crews who kept fighting through that night were doing so without any reasonable prospect of changing the outcome of the battle. What they were doing was fighting with what remained of their ships against an enemy that had positioned itself perfectly for exactly this purpose, in the dark, through the smoke, without the ability to see what was happening more than a few yards away, because fighting was what they had been ordered to do, and because stopping, in the middle of a battle, without orders to surrender, was not a thing that occurred to most of them as an option. The sounds of the battle carried across the water and reached the shore, where the army that Napoleon had brought to Egypt stood in its camps and listened to the fleet it depended on being destroyed in the darkness. The soldiers could see the gun flashes, could feel the low percussion of the broadsides through the ground beneath them, could watch the way the light shifted and brightened and pulsed over the water without being able to do a single thing about what it meant. The battle in the bay was entirely beyond their reach, and the men who understood what the scale and duration of the firing indicated knew, or were beginning to understand, that the world they had sailed into with such confidence in the spring was changing shape around them in the dark. In the bay itself, the British captains held their stations and kept firing. The process was not elegant. It was cumulative and relentless. The steady mechanical work of loading and firing, of maintaining range and position through the hours of darkness, of replacing men at the guns as men went down and keeping the rate of shot high enough to suppress any recovery in the French crews. The van was gone, the centre was burning and breaking, and further down the line toward the massive silhouette of Lorient, something else was beginning. A light that was not a gun flash had appeared against the flagship's hull, small at first, and then not small at all. That light, small and stuttering against the dark hull of Lorient, had been preceded by hours of punishment that most ships would not have survived at all. Lorient was the largest warship in the world at that moment, a 3-decked first-rate carrying 120 guns, her broadside weight alone roughly double that of any British 74 in the bay. She had been the axis around which the entire French line was organised, the ship from which Admiral François-Paul Brueys de Gallier commanded the fleet, and when the British ships had begun working through the van and into the centre, her guns had answered them with a weight of fire that reflected her size. HMS Bellerophon, which had closed with Lorient in the earlier part of the engagement, had been reduced to a near wreck for her ambition, her masts cut away, her gun decks torn open, her casualties among the highest in the British fleet that night. Courage in that pairing had not been enough, but the scale of Lorient's guns could not protect her quarterdeck from the same iron that was flying everywhere else in the bay, and it could not protect the man who stood at her centre. Brueys was still on the quarterdeck when a cannonball found him the first time. It shattered both his legs. What followed, in the accounts that have come down from survivors, carries the quality of a story that might seem theatrical if it were not so well attested. The Admiral refusing to leave his position, refusing to be carried below, having himself secured to a chair on the same quarter-deck where he had been wounded, so that he could continue to direct the battle from the command he had held throughout. Whether this was calculation or the particular kind of stubbornness that naval command in that era seemed to select for, it achieved exactly what it appears to have been intended to achieve. The guns kept firing, and the men around him kept working. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, a second shot struck him in the abdomen. He died shortly afterward, on the deck of his flagship in the chair in which he had chosen to remain. Command passed, but by the time it did, the situation that Brueys had been presiding over had taken on a momentum that no individual command decision could easily redirect. HMS Swiftsure had moved in to replace the battered Bellerophon against Lorient's flank, and other British ships were finding their angles, pressing in from positions that the French flagship's own size made it difficult to answer simultaneously. The rate of fire against her was sustained and accumulating, and the upper works of the great ship were taking the kind of damage that hours of close engagement always produced. Woodwork splintered and loose, rigging destroyed or trailing. The fabric of the ship opened in ways that exposed things inside her that were not meant to meet fire. And then, at around 9:30, the fire appeared. It showed first in the stern cabin, a glow that witnesses on nearby ships described as distinct from the gun flashes, lower, steadier, the wrong colour. French accounts recorded that the crew saw it and moved to contain it, and that for a short time they succeeded. bringing the flames down to a point where it seemed as though the ship might be saved. Then, perhaps 50 minutes later, it came back. This time, there was no containing it. What exactly caused that fire is a question that the sources of 1798 could not agree on, and that modern scholarship has not been able to resolve with certainty. 3 principal theories have circulated since the night itself. The most widely repeated in British accounts holds that a cannonball penetrated into or near the powder magazine, with the ignition following from that entry, an explanation that positions the explosion as the direct result of aimed fire and gives it a neat causal logic that appealed to those telling the story afterward. A second account, preserved through Sir Alexander Ball's secretary and discussed in detail in later records, describes a British lieutenant deliberately introducing combustible material, stray wadding, possibly red-hot shot, that caught against the flammable stores on the deck. A third explanation points to the ship herself. Lorient's upper deck surfaces had been treated with oil-based paint and lacquers in the period before the battle, and some accounts suggest that buckets or stores of this material had been left in exposed positions during the fighting, providing exactly the kind of accelerant that a stray spark from hours of cannon fire might have found in the dark. Each of these theories has contemporary witnesses who support it and other contemporary witnesses who contradict it. The truth of how the fire began is probably not recoverable at this point, and the honest weight of the evidence supports nothing more than plausibility for each account. What the evidence does support with far greater consistency is what happened once the fire took hold. It spread through the upper works of Lorient with a speed that suggested the prepared surfaces and accumulated debris of a ship that had been in close action for several hours. The stern cabin became untenable. The smoke began to carry outward across the water. Sailors on British ships close enough to have been exchanging broadsides with the flagship minutes before found themselves watching the flames climb her structure and begin to light the bay in a way that the gun flashes had not. Sustained illumination, growing rather than pulsing, throwing the shapes of masts and rigging and the dark water around them into a kind of terrible visibility. Nearby ships began to move away, cutting cables, backing off through the darkness, opening distance between themselves and what was coming. The French crew fought the fire for close to an hour. The testimony of survivors, of which there were far fewer than there should have been for a ship of that size and crew, speaks to attempts at the pumps, attempts to bring water to the burning sections, attempts to control what was rapidly becoming uncontrollable in the same way the battle itself had become uncontrollable, through professional discipline applied to a situation that had already moved beyond the point where discipline alone could determine the outcome. The glow above Lorient was visible from the shore by this point, where the French army watched from its camps along the coast. The men who had sailed from Toulon with this fleet, who had watched it depart Malta with such confidence in May, were looking at their flagship burning in a bay that had become, over the course of a single evening, the scene of the destruction of everything that held them connected to France. The fire reached the magazine at approximately 10 o'clock. What came next was not a part of the battle in any ordinary sense. It was an interruption of the battle, a moment so total that even the ship still locked in close engagement fell silent around it, their gun crews stopping without orders, standing at their positions in the sudden and absolute dark that followed the light, in the sudden and absolute stillness that followed the sound. The explosion that ended Lorient ended something else as well. Any remaining question about how this night was going to resolve, any remaining calculation about what the destruction of the van and the centre meant for the ships further down the French line. The flagship was gone, and with her the centre of the French fleet's command and the morale of everything that remained. The battle would continue. But from the moment Lorient's magazine went, it was no longer a battle in any meaningful sense. It was a conclusion being worked out in the dark. At 10 o'clock on the night of the 1st of August, 1798, Aboukir Bay became for a moment brighter than noon. The explosion that destroyed Lorient was not a sound that anyone who survived it was able to describe adequately, and the accounts that exist from both sides of the battle circle around the event with a kind of linguistic helplessness that is itself revealing. Sailors who had endured hours of continuous broadside fire, men for whom loud had become simply the ambient condition of the night, reached for words and found them insufficient. What they recorded instead were effects. The way the concussion moved across the water and struck the hulls of ships half a mile away with enough force to knock men from their feet, the column of fire and debris that climbed into the darkness above the bay and hung there for what witnesses described as several seconds before gravity began to reassemble it into falling wreckage. The way the flash bleached the scene white and then left everything behind it in a darkness that felt, after such light, like something more than the absence of light. It felt like blindness. The blast was heard in Alexandria. By several accounts, and given the stillness of a summer night in the eastern Mediterranean, there are credible reports that the sound carried as far as Cairo, roughly 150 miles inland, where the French army's landward elements heard something they could not yet interpret, and which the following days would explain to them in the worst possible terms. Then came the silence. For approximately 10 minutes, every gun in Aboukir Bay went quiet. No orders produced that silence, or rather, no single order could have produced it across both fleets simultaneously. It was a collective reaction, involuntary and total. The pause of men who had been engaged in one of the most violent encounters in naval history, suddenly confronted with something that exceeded even that frame of reference. Debris was still falling across the water, striking masts, cutting through rigging, landing among men who stood at their gun carriages and did not move. Nelson, wounded himself from earlier in the battle and below decks when the explosion occurred, reportedly emerged to find his ship gone quiet in a way that battle had not made it quiet. He ordered boats out immediately, not to resume fighting, but to recover survivors from the water around the position where Lorient had been. The flagship of the French Mediterranean fleet, 120 guns, the largest warship in the world, was simply gone. Where she had been, there was burning wreckage on the surface of the bay, and beneath it the beginning of an archaeological deposit that would not be found and studied for nearly 2 centuries. Fewer than 100 of Lorient's crew survived. The ship had carried somewhere above 1,000 men. Some estimates reach as high as 1,200. And the mathematical weight of that disparity takes a moment to absorb. In a single detonation, the French fleet lost more sailors than the British lost in the entire battle. The names of nearly all of them went with the ship, and what the historical record preserved instead were fragments. The death of Brueys on his quarterdeck, already noted, the fate of the man who had commanded Lorient herself, and one particular story that outlasted all the others, that passed out of history and into something more durable and more complicated than history. Captain Luc-Julien Joseph Casabianca had commanded Lorient. He died when she exploded. His son, Jocante, was 12 years old and had been on the ship with his father during the battle. He also died. The facts of the matter are that simple and that final. Father and son both lost with the flagship, their names preserved in the casualty record of a battle that took far more names than it preserved. Under any ordinary circumstances, that would have been the end of it. A small private tragedy absorbed into the larger catastrophe of the night. But in 1826, a Welsh poet named Felicia Hemans published a poem that she titled Casabianca, and what she did with those 2 deaths transformed them into something that the battle itself had not made them. Her poem described a boy standing at his post on the burning deck of a ship, remaining there through the fire and the chaos, calling out to his father for permission to leave, receiving no answer because his father was already dead, and dying where he stood because he would not abandon his post without permission from an authority that no longer existed. The image was precise and devastating. Duty carried so far past the point where duty could matter that it became a kind of tragedy in itself, a child's obedience consuming the child. The opening lines became, in the century that followed, among the most recognised in the English language. The boy stood on the burning deck, whence all but he had fled. What Hemans rendered was poetry, which operates under different obligations than history, and the poem should be understood on these terms. The historical record does not confirm that Gioconte Casabianca remained at his post, called out for his father, or refused to flee. It confirms that he was 12, that he was on the ship, and that he died. The poem took that fact and built from it a structure of meaning that the bare fact alone could not carry. The conflict between duty and self-preservation, the terrible completeness of a loyalty that persists even when its object is gone. Whether or not it happened in the way the poem described, it captured something that the battle itself had produced in abundance. The image of individuals consumed by forces they had not chosen and could not escape, standing at their stations while the world came apart around them. The poem was memorised by schoolchildren across the English-speaking world for generations. It was parodied, which is its own form of cultural immortality. You do not parody what has been forgotten. It entered the language as a shorthand for a particular kind of futile steadfastness, the sort of loyalty that continues past the point where it serves any purpose. And through all of that, Gioconte Casabianca, the 12-year-old son of a French naval captain who died in a bay on the Egyptian coast, became a figure that more people knew than had ever heard of his father or of Lorient, or of the battle itself. The explosion had that quality of becoming, in the cultural memory that formed around it, something larger than the military event of which it was a part. The destruction of the flagship was the pivot of the Battle of the Nile, the moment that confirmed what the preceding hours had already decided and rendered any further French resistance essentially symbolic. But in the way that certain images accumulate meaning beyond their immediate context, the burning of Lorient became an emblem that carried out beyond naval history into something more like national mythology. The catastrophic end of a great enterprise, witnessed by the stars above Egypt and the shores of Aboukir, and by men on both sides who had spent the night trying to kill each other, and who are now, in the silence after the explosion, standing at their posts in the dark, listening to the last debris fall into the water and waiting to understand what had just happened to them. The guns began again, eventually. The battle's conclusion was still to be worked out across the remaining hours of the night, and there were French ships further down the line that had not yet been taken. But the centre was gone, the flagship was gone, and the silence that followed the explosion, that strange, involuntary 10 minutes of stillness, was the sound of a campaign ending. When the guns resumed, they resumed in a different world than the one in which they had fallen silent. The destruction of Lorient had not ended the battle, but it had ended any serious question about the battle's outcome. What remained in the hours after the explosion was not a contest so much as a reckoning, the methodical working out of a result that had, in strategic terms, already been decided. The French ships that still flew their colours did so not because they held any real prospect of reversing what had happened, but because surrender is its own kind of decision, one that men under fire do not always reach at the same moment. Along the van and centre of the French line, the situation was already beyond recovery. Ship after ship had been silenced in the hours before the explosion. The Guerrier, whose foremast had come down in the battle's opening minutes, already struck before Lorient even caught fire. The Conquérant, the Spartiate, the Aquilon, the Peuple Souverain, all taken or disabled in the grinding work of the double attack that the British had been pressing since Foley led the Goliath inside the line at the start of the engagement. The Franklin, the French ship immediately ahead of Lorient's position, continued fighting for a time into the night, her officers and men sustaining resistance against odds that had become categorical. she eventually struck her colours in the early hours of the 2nd of August. Tonnant to the rear of the flagship, fought with a ferocity that earned her a particular place in the battle's accounts. But she too was eventually silenced and taken. Further back, toward the rear of the French line, the situation was different in texture if not in final meaning. Rear Admiral Villeneuve commanded the rearmost ships, and the movements of those vessels over the course of the night have been debated by historians with varying degrees of sympathy and censure ever since. The ships at the rear had been positioned too far from the fighting to engage effectively in the battle's early stages, and as the night progressed and the scale of the catastrophe at the centre became apparent, Villeneuve made the decision that has defined his place in the histories of this engagement. On the morning of the 2nd of August, he gathered what remained, Guillaume Thiel, Généreux, and 2 frigates, Justice and Diane, and put them out of the bay. Of the 13 French ships of the line that had entered Aboukir Bay, 11 were destroyed, run aground, or taken as prizes. Heureux and Mercure were driven onto the shoals and were later destroyed rather than allowed to fall into British hands. Timoleon grounded and was burned by her own crew. The rest, Guerrier, Conquérant, Spartiate, Aquilon, Peuple Souverain, Franklin, Tonnant, and the burning wreckage of Lorient where she had once anchored, remained in the bay in various states of ruin or capture. Only 2 ships of the line escaped with Villeneuve, only 2 out of 13. The frigates Justice and Diane accompanied them. Everything else was gone. The scale of that accounting needs to be held in the mind for a moment before moving on from it, because casualty figures, which are the usual way of measuring what a battle cost, are in this case both contested and in some sense secondary to the larger fact of the fleet's destruction. The numbers that survive do not agree with each other. British casualties are recorded with relative clarity, somewhere in the region of 218 killed and 678 wounded, a total of roughly 900 men out of the fleet that had attacked. Even the British figure carries some variability between sources, but the broad shape of it is consistent. The French figures are far less certain and far more contested. Contemporary estimates range from around 2,000 dead and wounded to figures approaching 5,000, with additional thousands taken prisoner as captured ships were secured and their crews counted. Historians have examined these numbers with appropriate skepticism, noting that the chaos of a night engagement, the destruction of the flagship, the burning of several ships, the darkness, the subsequent movement of men between vessels, made accurate counting at the time essentially impossible. The precise figure almost certainly lies somewhere within that wide range, and the honest position is to acknowledge that the range itself is the answer, not to collapse it into a single number that one source happens to prefer. What is certain is the disproportion. British losses were serious. 218 men killed is not a rounding error. It represents a toll extracted in close, brutal, hours-long fighting at ranges where naval combat strips away most of what war usually places between a man and the projectile aimed at him. The wounded figure tells its own story about the nature of that fighting. The splinter wounds that 18th century naval surgery treated with varying success. The burns, the injuries from falling rigging and collapsing gun carriages, the long aftermath of a night when men had stood at their guns and absorbed everything the French line could send at them. Nelson himself was wounded in the head early in the battle and was below decks when Lorient exploded, having briefly believed his wound was mortal. Several of his captains were killed or seriously hurt. The victory was real, but it was not clean, and the men who won it paid for it in a currency that Admiralty reports captured only partially. But the disproportion remains, and it matters in a particular way. Even accepting the lower end of the French casualty estimates, the battle destroyed approximately twice or 3 times as many men on the French side as on the British, and this is before accounting for the prisoners. The surviving crews of captured ships whose war was now functionally over regardless of whether any formal treaty said so. And even all of that arithmetic, however sobering, is not quite the point. The destruction of the French Mediterranean fleet mattered more than any death toll could express. The men who died in Aboukir Bay died in the course of determining who would control the eastern Mediterranean for the foreseeable future, and when the bay fell quiet in the morning and Villeneuve's small squadron shrank toward the horizon, that question had been answered. The Royal Navy now held those waters without serious contest. The supply lines that had connected Napoleon's army in Egypt to France, always theoretical, always dependent on the fleet maintaining itself, were severed not temporarily but decisively. The 30,000 men who had marched inland, who had fought at the pyramids and occupied Cairo and stared at the Sphinx in the summer heat, were still there. They had not lost, but the world around them had changed in a single night into something much more like a trap than a campaign. The ships at the bottom of Aboukir Bay and the ships that limped into French ports as prizes of war were not merely units destroyed or captured. They were the infrastructure of an entire strategic vision, the vision of a French Mediterranean empire that could threaten British India, that could project power eastward and hold it there. That vision had not died with the soldiers who fell at any particular land engagement. It had died with the fleet here, in a bay on the Egyptian coast, in the hours between one evening and the next morning, under the stars that the sailors on both sides described looking up at in the intervals between the firing, wondering what the night would bring. What it had brought was this: 11 French ships of the line captured or destroyed, 2 frigates taken with them, thousands dead or taken prisoner, and 2 ships sailing east toward a horizon that offered no comfort. The Battle of the Nile was over. The morning that followed was quiet in the way that only mornings after great violence can be, a stillness that is not peace but exhaustion, the bay glassy and littered, the British fleet riding at anchor among the wreckage of what had been 24 hours earlier the finest Mediterranean fleet France possessed. For the sailors who had survived the night on both sides, the immediate world was defined by thirst, wounds, smoke blackened rigging, and the labour of securing prizes. But 40 miles to the south, in Cairo, 30,000 French soldiers woke to a morning that looked, from the inside, exactly like any other morning of occupation. They did not yet know that everything had changed. The news reached Napoleon by courier, and the accounts of his reaction vary, as accounts of Napoleon's private moments always tend to vary, filtered through the self-interest of those who recorded them. What is not disputed is the strategic reality that the courier carried with it, a reality that no amount of composure or calculated indifference could alter. The fleet was gone, not diminished, not damaged and withdrawing to refit, but gone. 11 ships of the line destroyed or taken, 2 frigates with them, and Villeneuve's small squadron somewhere over the horizon with nothing useful left in it. The army that had marched so confidently inland was now stranded on the wrong side of the Mediterranean, separated from France by a sea that the Royal Navy now controlled, without any serious challenge remaining to contest it. The word stranded deserves to be turned over slowly, because it captures something that purely military language tends to obscure. Napoleon's army had not been defeated in the field. It had won at the pyramids. It occupied Egypt. It would go on winning land engagements for some time afterward. But winning in the field while losing the sea means something very specific in the age of sail. It means that reinforcements cannot reliably arrive, that supplies cannot reliably arrive, that communication with Paris becomes irregular and then sporadic and then almost fictional. It means that the army exists, but that the campaign, the living, breathing strategic enterprise that an army is supposed to serve, has been severed from its foundations. The French soldiers in Egypt were not defeated. They were marooned. British command of the sea in the eastern Mediterranean was not merely theoretical after the Nile. it was exercised with the kind of practical immediacy that turned strategic advantage into daily operational reality. A close blockade of Alexandria followed, cutting the port that had been the French army's sole connection to the sea. Dispatches to Paris took increasingly circuitous routes. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered, not because Paris lacked the will, but because France lacked the means to move men through a sea the Royal Navy now treated as its own. The cordon was not perfect. Nothing in 18th century naval warfare was perfect, but it was effective enough to mean that the French army's position in Egypt would harden, over time, from occupation into something closer to siege. The consequences radiated outward from Aboukir Bay in ways that reached far beyond Egypt. The news of the French defeat spread rapidly through the courts and capitals of Europe, and it did what dramatic victories at sea had always done to the strategic calculations of uncertain allies. It changed the arithmetic. States that had been watching from a cautious distance began to recalculate. Portugal, Naples, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, powers that had their own grievances against France and their own reasons to fear French expansion, found in the Nile's outcome the encouragement they needed. Within months, the coalition against France had grown into the Second Coalition, expanding the war across the eastern Mediterranean and applying pressure to French positions from Malta to the Ionian Islands. A single night in a bay on the Egyptian coast had altered the diplomatic landscape of an entire continent, not because battles automatically produced treaties, but because the destruction of the French fleet removed the thing that had made French power in the region credible. Nowhere were these consequences more concrete than at Acre in the spring of 1799, when Napoleon, recognizing the impossibility of simply waiting in Egypt while his army slowly consumed itself, decided to march northeast into Syria in an attempt to break out of the strategic trap. He encountered at Acre a fortress that should not, by any rational calculation, have been able to stop him. Acre's defences were old and imperfect, its Ottoman garrison not obviously capable of resisting a French army that had swept through Egypt. But Commodore Sidney Smith arrived with a British naval squadron, and with that squadron he brought everything that the Battle of the Nile had made possible. Shipborne guns reinforced the landward defences. When French siege artillery, heavy guns shipped separately along the coast to support the assault, was intercepted and captured at sea, those same cannon were turned against the French besiegers from the walls they had been sent to breach. Without the Nile, Smith's squadron would not have been there. Without the Nile, French supply ships could have moved freely along the Syrian coast. Without the Nile, Acre might have fallen, and the campaign Napoleon imagined, reaching toward Constantinople, toward India, toward the Eastern Empire he had constructed in his ambition, might have had somewhere further to go. Instead, Napoleon besieged Acre for 2 months, launched assault after assault against walls defended in part with his own captured artillery, watched his men die of plague as well as of shot and shell, and finally gave the order to withdraw. The retreat back through the desert to Egypt was among the most harrowing episodes the French army endured in the entire Egyptian campaign, and it returned Napoleon to Cairo with nothing gained and much lost. The Eastern ambition was finished. The campaign would continue. There would be more battles, more victories even, but the destination had been removed. The army that had come to Egypt to open a road to India was now simply trying to survive in Egypt. Napoleon himself left. In August of 1799, little more than a year after the Nile, he slipped away from Alexandria with a small escort, evading the British blockade in a fast frigate and returning to France, where political opportunity had opened in his absence. He left his army behind, commanded now by Kleber and then by Menou, diminishing in strength, cut off from resupply, slowly losing the attrition of occupation. The final evacuation came in 1801, when the French forces that remained in Egypt surrendered to a British and Ottoman force and were repatriated, sent home at British expense. the last act of a campaign that had begun with such extravagant ambition in Toulon harbour 3 years earlier. The real power of the Battle of the Nile lay precisely in this long unravelling. The night itself, the fire, the explosion, the broken French line, was spectacular enough to enter legend immediately, and it did. But what the battle actually accomplished unfolded over 3 years of grinding consequence. A fleet gone, a blockade sustained, a fortress held, a march turned back, a general slipping away in the dark, an army surrendering on a shore it had once conquered. The battle did not end Napoleon's career or even his ambitions in the long run. He was back in France before the Egyptian campaign had finished its slow collapse, and within months he was first consul. History has a way of absorbing even catastrophic setbacks into the larger story of whoever survives them. But the Eastern Empire, that particular vision built on the assumption that France could hold the sea long enough to hold Egypt long enough to threaten India, died in Aboukir Bay, and it never came back. What the night of the 1st of August 1798 ended was not Napoleon. It was the version of Napoleon's future that depended on the ships now lying in the mud at the bottom of the bay. Victories of that magnitude do not simply pass into the historical record. They pass into the landscape, into the names of ships, into the lines of poems learned by schoolchildren, into the shape of the earth itself on quiet English hillsides far from any sea. The Battle of the Nile was one of the most complete naval victories in the age of sail, and British culture in the years and decades that followed was not content to let it remain a matter of dispatches and naval reports. It needed to be marked, planted, carved, and carried, given physical form in stone and timber and soil, so that future generations would understand not just that something important had happened, but precisely how it felt to receive the news on a country estate at Amesbury in Wiltshire, sometime in the years around 1798. A planting of beech trees was laid out across the grounds in a pattern that had nothing to do with conventional landscaping. Each clump of trees corresponded to a ship, British and French, positioned according to Robert Dodd's published battle map, their placement across the hillside approximating the formation in Aboukir Bay on the evening of the 1st of August. As many as 26 or 30 original clumps were created, though sources vary on the precise number and the exact timing of the planting is not entirely certain. Some accounts suggest an informal early commemoration, others link the final form of the design more closely to the period following Nelson's death in 1805. 17 of those clumps survive today, weathered and grown beyond their original intent. Beech trees tall enough now to seem like features of the landscape rather than symbols imposed upon it, but the symbolic intent was always the point. Someone had looked at a map of a naval battle and decided that the best way to honour it was to walk through a living representation of it, to stand on an English hillside and look across at the positions of Bellerophon and Majestic and the burning shape of Lorient rendered in rooted wood. The Nile clumps at Amesbury are one of the stranger monuments in English commemorative tradition, and one of the most quietly moving. Other commemorations were less subtle. At Hall Place in Berkshire, Sir William East planted a double line of oak trees, each tree representing a ship from the opposing fleets, and added to the grounds a pyramid built to scale and a life-size statue of Nelson himself. A private estate transformed into a personal monument to a public triumph. Across Britain, streets, public houses, and parish records filled with Nile references. The Royal Navy institutionalised the memory more formally, naming successive ships HMS Aboukir, HMS Nile, and HMS Canopus after the battle and its geography, carrying the victory forward into later generations of the fleet as a kind of inherited honour. Gold, silver and copper-gilt medals were issued to participants. the physical tokens of a navy that understood the power of marking service in permanent metal. And then there is Cleopatra's Needle, the great Egyptian obelisk that now stands on the Victoria Embankment in London, ancient granite carved during the reign of Thutmose III and later claimed by successive empires, was presented to Britain in 1819 by Muhammad Ali of Egypt as a formal recognition of the Battle of 1798 and the subsequent campaign of 1801 that finally expelled the French from the country they had occupied. The obelisk itself had nothing to do with Cleopatra or with Nelson. It was ancient in ways that dwarfed both of them by several thousand years. But the gift carried a specific historical argument that British naval power, exercised in Aboukir Bay on a single night, had changed Egypt's fate, and that this massive fragment of antiquity was an appropriate measure of that change. It took nearly 60 years and a considerable feat of Victorian engineering to actually get the obelisk to London. It finally arrived on the embankment in 1878, but when it did, it brought with it a thread of memory that ran from the pharaohs through Napoleon's scholars to Nelson's gunners, binding ancient Egypt and modern naval warfare together in a single granite column beside the Thames. On the bay itself, the small island that the British had seized and fortified after the battle acquired a new name, Nelson's Island. It served for a time as a burial ground for Royal Navy sailors and officers recovered from the wrecks and the fighting, 30 men whose remains eventually lay in foreign sand on an island in an Egyptian bay, beneath an informal monument to a battle most of the world had already half forgotten. In 2005, those remains were reinterred at Chatby Commonwealth War Cemetery, given a formality and a permanence that the original gravesite had never quite managed to provide. The reburial was a quiet reminder that behind every monument and every planted hillside there were actual bodies. Men who had died in the smoke and the noise and the burning oil, whose names appeared on the casualty lists and then receded from public memory, even as the abstractions derived from their deaths grew larger and more ornate. That tension is worth pausing over, because it runs through almost all the commemorative history of the Nile. The public memory of the battle was shaped from the beginning by a powerful machinery of heroic narrative. Felicia Heman's poem Casablanca, with its famous opening line about the boy who stood on the burning deck, turned a detail of the battle's most dramatic moment into one of the most widely memorized verses in the English language, a story of loyalty and sacrifice so polished and so deliberately emotional that it almost entirely displaced the more complicated reality beneath it. The actual boy, the son of Lorient's commander, had indeed died when the ship exploded, but the poem transformed his death into an emblem of perfect obedience, a moral lesson convenient enough to survive in schoolrooms for a century and a half. What the poem did not dwell on was the wider carnage, the French casualties that range in different sources from 2,000 to 5,000 dead, the thousands more taken prisoner, the British losses of over 200 killed and nearly 700 wounded, the ordinary sailors on both sides who experienced that night not as a matter of historical significance, but as hours of absolute terror and physical destruction. The Band of Brothers narrative, as it came to be called, the idea of Nelson and his captains as a perfectly bonded fellowship of tactical genius, was equally useful and equally selective. It honoured real qualities, genuine courage, real professional skill, the remarkable coherence of a fleet that attacked without detailed orders because its captains understood their admiral's intentions well enough to act without them, but it also smoothed away the disorder, the friendly fire, the ships grounded on shoals, the captains killed before they could see the outcome, the wounded lying on decks for hours in the dark. Memory works by selecting what is useful to preserve, and what was useful about the Nile was the cleanness of the victory, the completeness of the French defeat, the sense that British naval power had been demonstrated in its most ideal form. The rougher textures, The suffering, the uncertainty, the sheer physical brutality of close-range cannon fire maintained through a night tended to be softened into the background of the monument, present if you looked carefully, invisible if you did not. What endures at Aboukir Bay is something that no monument on an English hillside or London embankment can fully replicate. The place itself, marked still by the wreckage of what happened there, the geography that shaped the battle as much as any human decision did. The bay remains what it was in 1798, a shallow particular stretch of water with its own character, its sandbars and its currents, the island that bears Nelson's name still visible from the Egyptian shore. The commemorations in Britain pointed back toward it like compasses, and the bay held everything they pointed at, including, beneath its surface, the physical remains of the ships themselves, waiting for a different kind of remembrance. That mention of the bay holding everything beneath its surface is not merely poetic. For nearly 2 centuries after the battle, Aboukir Bay kept its secrets with remarkable patience. The wrecks of the French fleet settled into the sand and silt at depths shallow enough in some places that fishermen's nets occasionally snagged on something old and iron. Local stories circulated, as they always do around submerged disasters, and the occasional fragment worked its way to the surface, but the ships themselves remained largely undisturbed, buried, scattered, slowly claimed by the sea floor, while the commemorative machinery on land continued to build monuments to events whose physical evidence lay quietly offshore. The first serious attempt to change that came in 1983, when a French marine archaeologist named Jacques Dumas launched a systematic search for Napoleon's sunken fleet. Dumas had spent years piecing together the historical record, battle maps, naval logs, eyewitness accounts, and believed that enough of the ships remained identifiable to make a proper scientific survey worthwhile. Working with the limited technology available to underwater archaeology in that era, his team located what they believed to be L'Orient and at least 3 other French vessels, their positions in the bay roughly consistent with the tactical accounts that had survived in the archives. It was a significant achievement. Though the tools of the time meant that the survey remained incomplete, the identifications provisional, and the full picture of what lay beneath Aboukir's water still unclear. Dumas died before the work could be finished, leaving behind a foundation on which others would eventually build. That continuation fell to Frank Goddio, a French underwater explorer who took up the project in 1996 with substantially more sophisticated resources at his disposal. Where Dumas had worked with the methods of an earlier generation, Goddio's team brought side-scan sonar, computer-generated seabed mapping, and the capacity to coordinate hundreds of expert dives in a systematic overlapping survey of the bay's floor. The result, produced between 1996 and 1999, was the first genuinely detailed underwater chart of Aboukir Bay, a document that mapped not just where wreckage lay but how it was oriented, how it had settled, how the explosion and the subsequent years of burial had dispersed the evidence across the sediment. For historians trying to reconstruct exactly how the battle unfolded tactically, the precise placement of anchors and hull sections provided something that no written account could offer: physical corroboration fixed in the geography of the seafloor itself. The identification of L'Orient was confirmed by the discovery of a bronze nameplate, not bearing the name L'Orient, which had only been assigned to the ship after France's revolutionary government took possession of her, but carrying her earlier identity as the Royal Dauphin, the name under which her keel had been laid and her hull shaped. That detail alone told a small story about the revolutionary upheavals that had renamed so much of French life in the years before the battle. Hull fragments confirmed the size. A 120-gun first-rate warship of roughly 2,000 tons, the largest vessel in the French fleet, and one of the largest warships afloat anywhere in the world in 1798. At a depth of around 12 meters, approximately 40 feet, divers recovered a 35-foot rudder, a massive bronze carronade, and the ship's original anchors, all of them bearing the accumulated weight of 200 years in salt water, their surfaces encrusted but their forms still unmistakable. What they also found, distributed across the wreck site in the sediment, were coins, thousands of them, in gold, silver and copper, originating from Malta, the Ottoman Empire, Venice, Spain and Portugal, a geographical scatter of currency that mirrored the route the fleet had taken across the Mediterranean and the places from which Napoleon's campaign had drawn its resources. The coins were the physical residue of the most persistent legend attached to Lorient, the story of the Maltese treasure. When Napoleon had taken Malta from the Knights of St. John in June of 1798, his forces had stripped the island's ancient order of much of its accumulated wealth before sailing on toward Egypt. Exactly how much went aboard Lorient has never been precisely established, and the coins recovered by Godio's team represent only a fraction of whatever total may have existed. Contemporary accounts spoke of 12 solid silver apostle statues among the treasures taken from Malta, a detail that captured imaginations then, and has continued to shape the legend ever since. The archaeological record is more modest and more complicated, mixed origin coins and modest bullion rather than a gleaming haul of ecclesiastical silver, a reminder that legends have a tendency to grow proportionally to the silence surrounding their subject, and that 2 centuries of unanswered questions had given this one considerable room to expand. What the wreck offered beyond the coins was something that no treasure legend had prepared anyone for. The texture of ordinary life aboard an 18th century warship. Divers brought up bronze cannon and lead type from a shipboard printing press. Lorient had carried the equipment to produce proclamations and documents for Napoleon's Egyptian administration, a detail that underscores how thoroughly the expedition had been conceived as a colonial project rather than a simple military campaign. Cooking pots, silverware and fragments of clothing emerged from the sediment alongside human skeletal remains, each category of object telling a different part of the same story about the hundreds of men who'd been alive on those decks on the evening of the 1st of August 1798 and dead by midnight. The bones are perhaps the most sobering category of find, more immediate in their testimony than any coin or cannon. They are what remains of the casualties, the men counted in those disputed figures. 2,000 dead, or perhaps 5,000, the sources refusing to agree even now, whose experience of the battle was not tactical but purely physical, a matter of fire and concussion and the sudden end of things. The artifacts recovered from Lorient and the surrounding wreck sites have been divided between Egyptian authorities and French institutions, displayed in museums and in travelling exhibitions that have carried the material evidence of the battle to audiences who would never visit Aboukir Bay. That division of custody is itself significant, a reflection of the fact that the battle happened in Egyptian waters, involved French ships, and has been remembered primarily through a British lens, and that the physical objects recovered from the sea floor belong to a history that no single national narrative can fully contain. The exhibitions have done something that monuments carved in granite or beech trees planted on English hillsides cannot quite accomplish. They have placed visitors in direct proximity to the actual substance of the event, to objects that were present on the night itself, that absorbed the heat and the shock and the silence that followed, and that have been returned from the deep carrying that proximity still. Underwater archaeology has a particular relationship to historical imagination that surface excavation rarely achieves. There is something about the depth and the darkness, the stillness of a seafloor site undisturbed for generations, that lends recovered objects a quality of unmediated contact with the past that is difficult to articulate, but easy to feel, standing in a museum gallery before a corroded anchor or a scatter of coins still holding their original shapes in the sediment, Godio's surveys of Aboukir Bay renewed public interest in the battle, not because they confirmed the treasure legends, they complicated and partly deflated them, but because they replaced legend with something more durable: evidence. The wreck of Lorient is not a myth. It is a specific location in a specific bay at a specific depth, identifiable by its nameplate and its anchors and the bones of its crew, and the battle that put it there was not a story of clean heroism, but a night of fire, noise and catastrophic human cost from which the Mediterranean world emerged permanently changed. The ships beneath Aboukir Bay are the battle's most honest monument, and yet monuments, whether carved in stone or resting on the sea floor, only preserve what time has already settled into meaning. The battle itself was not a monument. It was a night of extraordinary violence compressed into a few hours of darkness above the Egyptian coast, and what it produced, when the last guns fell silent and the dawn came up over the wreckage of the French Mediterranean fleet, was not a clean historical lesson, but an irreversible shift in the way the world was arranged. Return for a moment to the bay as it was on the evening of the 1st of August 1798. The French fleet at anchor in a long crescent line, the shoals close to windward, the assumption of safety built into that formation, the reasonable belief that no commander would dare bring his ships into unknown shallows after dark. Then the British sails appearing on the horizon, the sequence of decisions made in minutes rather than hours, and the moment when HMS Goliath rounded the head of the French line and opened fire from a direction the portside guns were not ready to answer. What followed was not a single decisive blow, but a progressive dismantling ship by ship, as the doubling manoeuvre brought each French vessel under fire from two sides simultaneously, and the night filled with gun smoke so thick that men fired by the light of their own muzzle flashes, unable to see anything beyond the nearest deck. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, the flagship Lorient caught fire. The exact cause remains unresolved. Oil paint residues on the poop deck, burning wadding carried on the wind from British guns, some accident below. And the uncertainty is appropriate because no one who was close enough to know precisely what started it lived to give a coherent account. What is certain is that the fire spread, that it reached the magazine, and that the explosion which followed was heard in Cairo. A warship of roughly 2,000 tons, the largest vessel in the French fleet, was removed from the surface of the Mediterranean in a single moment. Admiral Brueys, already wounded twice, died in that detonation or shortly before it. The boy Casabianca became a legend. The guns on both sides fell silent for several minutes afterward, an involuntary pause in the battle imposed not by tactics, but by the scale of what had just happened, by the need of every living person in the bay to simply absorb the fact of it. Then the battle resumed and continued through the night, and by morning the numbers told a story that admitted no ambiguity about its strategic consequence. British losses stood at around 218 killed and approximately 677 wounded, significant but manageable for a fleet that remained intact and operational. French losses ranged, depending on the source, from 2,000 to 5,000 dead, with thousands more captured and wounded, and the fleet itself reduced from an instrument of Mediterranean power to scattered wreckage. 11 of 13 French ships of the line were sunk or taken. The frigates escaped. Almost nothing else did. The strategic consequence followed with the inevitability of arithmetic. Napoleon's army was in Egypt, and the ships that had carried it there no longer existed as a fighting force, capable of keeping the supply lines open or the British Navy at bay. France lost control of the Mediterranean Sea, not for a campaign or a season, but for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. The general who had envisioned an Eastern Empire, a route to India, a blow to British commercial power across the whole of the Orient, found himself stranded in a country he could not hold indefinitely. dependent on a home government he could not reliably reach. His grand strategy reduced to the local problem of survival. The Battle of the Nile did not end Napoleon's career. He was resilient enough, and circumstances complex enough, for that story to continue for another 17 years. But it closed off the Eastern possibility permanently, and in doing so it redirected the shape of everything that followed. The broader history moved accordingly. The Ottoman Empire, alarmed by the French occupation of Egypt, entered the war. Britain consolidated its position at sea. A second coalition formed. The Mediterranean, which Napoleon had imagined as a corridor of French expansion, became instead the clearest demonstration of British naval supremacy, a lesson that the battle had written in fire and reinforced with every subsequent year of French maritime weakness. None of that had been inevitable before the night of the 1st of August. The margin between the two fleets, at the moment Nelson sighted the anchored line, was narrow enough that a different set of decisions, Brueys choosing to put to sea, the French port guns properly manned, the shoals between the fleet and the shore treated as the barrier they were designed to be, might have produced a very different outcome. History does not often advertise how close its turning points came to turning the other way. What remains now is the bay, the wrecks settling quietly into the sediment at 12 metres depth, the recovered coins and cannons and bones in their museum cases, and the long consequence of a single night reaching forward through everything that came after it, still shaping, still present, still unfinished in the way that only genuinely decisive moments ever are.